As we keep going through the Old Testament, in particular Israel's history, we have left the days when Israel did not have a king. This week we start the period of the monarchy. That means they have monarchs, royalty, kings. This is a period of only about 400 some years. Didn't last very long. The first three kings have the United Kingdom. I'm not talking about England. That means all 12 tribes were unified under a king. Three of them, King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. After that, the kingdom was divided for a good long time because the nation was divided. 10 of the tribes in the north were referred to as the nation of Israel. The 2 tribes left in the south were referred to as Judah, and each had its own kings. We'll be taking a look at that in some detail. This week, Saul, the first king, is anointed. And there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish. Bet they had fun with that one. The son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bacharath, son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a man of wealth. Keep that in mind. A son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. And from his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So, just by human nature, if you're going to pick a guy to be king, who are you going to pick? You'll pick a rich guy. He obviously knows what to do with money. And you'll pick somebody that's really tall because people are attracted to that, and terribly good looking. I'm sorry, I don't know how that got in there. In any case, God is responding to the people's desire for a king by giving them the type of a king that they would have chosen for themselves, and as if to say, let's see how this works out for you. Now the donkeys of Kish, that's Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to Saul his son, take one of the servants with you and arise and go look for these donkeys. But they did not find them. So his servant says to Saul, behold, there is a man of God. Now, at this time, who is the man of God in Israel? Samuel, the prophet Samuel. He's in this city, and he is a man that is held in honor. All that he says comes true. You remember last week when the scripture said none of Samuel's words fell to the ground? That meant if he said it was going to happen, or this is the way that it is, that's the way that it is. And the servant says, let's go there. Perhaps he can tell us about the journey on which we have set out and whether we're going to find these donkeys or not. But the day before Saul came to Samuel, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel. Tomorrow, about this time, I am sending you a man from Benjamin, and you will anoint him to be the prince over my people Israel. Now, wait a minute, Jim. The people asked for a king. What do you want to give him a prince for? Well, because of Disney and because of medieval royalty, what do we think the prince is? We think the prince is the son of a king. Well, that's not how it works in the Bible. When someone is referred to as the prince, they are referring to him as the leader of the people, primarily focusing on his military role as the commander of God's people. And this is why God is raising up Saul so that he can be a military leader. He shall save or deliver my people from the hands of the Philistines. You don't do that just as a king. You do that as the prince, the guy with the sword. For I have seen the affliction of my people, because their cry has come to me. And when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, Here's the man of whom I spoke to you. He it is who shall rule over my people. So sometimes Saul is going to be referred to the prince. Sometimes he's going to be referred to as the king. So Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it over his head. And Saul said, well, man, that just kind of ruins my hairdo. And he kissed him, and he said, has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord. Don't forget that. They are the people of the Lord. And you will save them from the hand of their enemies round about. And when he turned his back to leave Samuel, God gave Saul another heart. So Saul is then presented to Israel as the king. So Samuel calls all the people of the Lord together at Mizpah. And Samuel said to all the people, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people. And the people shouted, long live the king. And then Samuel told the people the rights and the duties of the kingship. He wrote them in a book and laid it up before the Lord. Then Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his own home. Saul also went to his home at Gibeah, and there went with him men of valor whose hearts God had touched. Samuel doesn't think much of this. He's kind of confused. He even tried to hide from his coronation or presentation to Israel. He didn't know what to make of this, so he just, like everybody else, he heads home. But I want you to notice that God is already working to make Saul a deliverer of the Lord's people. He is moving the hearts of men of valor that are good in battle, and they go home to Gibeah with Saul. He's probably confused about that as well. God will make it clear. So let's take a look at Saul's victories. Then Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. All right. Now, who remembers where Gilead is? It's over here on the west side of the Jordan. Do you remember where the Ammonites live? They live over here on the west side of the people of Gad and Manasseh, on the west side of the Jordan. And they had a big fit a few decades earlier, and they decided they wanted the land that Israel had taken when they came through the land hundreds of years ago. And God raised up a fellow named Jephthah, who was a Gileadite. And Jephthah says, what are you picking on us for? And the king of Ammon says, that's our land. And knowing his biblical history, Jephthah says, how do you figure? And he gives him the whole history. This land belonged to the Amorites. You may have wanted it. They may have taken it from you. But we took it from the Amorites. We didn't take it from you. And the king of Ammon didn't say, oh, I forgot about that. He just decided he'd get real froggy and attack. And Jephthah, thanks to the Lord, whipped his tail. And they didn't like that. So, they're out for revenge. How do I know? You'll see in just a second. All the men of Jabesh Gilead said to Nahash, the Ammonite, make a treaty with us and we will serve you. In other words, we know that you are about to kick our heinies, and we don't want to die. So wouldn't it be better just to save yourself the trouble of going through with this battle, and we'll pay you tribute, we'll serve you in any way that you want. But Nahash the Ammonite, eager for revenge, says, on this condition will I make a treaty with you, that I gouge out all of your right eyes and thus put the disgrace upon Israel. Why? Because Israel had put the disgrace on Ammon a number of decades before. So we know what he's up to. So the elders of Jabesh Gilead said to him, give us 7 days of respite from this battle, that we may send messengers throughout all the territory of Israel. And then if there is no one to save us, we'll give ourselves up to you. So let me stop there. Tell me how much sense this makes. Let's say that you're out on the playground at school and you're in a fight with another boy, and you're getting your tail kicked, and you say, hold up just a second. Let's take a breather, and let me go around the playground and see if I can get any of my friends to help me with this battle. What do? You kick him. You kick him to the curb. What in the world is Nahash thinking? Sure, bring it on. We're tough. We can handle anything. That's what he thinks. Go see if anybody will help you. And that's what he does. So messengers go out all over Israel. And when these messengers came down into Benjamin, to the town of Gibeah, where Saul lives, they reported the matter in the ears of the people, and all the people wept aloud. They're crying. They're weeping. Oh, woe to us. This is the end of the world. They're going to kill all the guys from Jabesh Gilead, and then they're going to come over here for us. Now, what did they just get done doing? They cried to the Lord for a king who could lead them into battle. And what did they get? God gave them a king to lead them into battle. And what are they doing? They're weeping and whining. Let me show you where we're talking about here. That little blue skinny line down the middle of your map is the Jordan River. Just to the right of it, to the east of it, on up near the top, you see it in red, Jabesh Gilead, in the land of Gilead. Now, work your way across the Jordan River to the west, and you see down the bottom of the map is Jerusalem. Well, just up above that is Gibeah. If you draw a straight line, you're looking about 112 to 115 miles away. And they've got 7 days of a break from this battle so that they can get some help. Now, that's not the only place that they send messengers. They sent messengers throughout all of Israel. But when the news gets to Gibeah, they're doing just like everybody else. Wah! This is the end. So, the Spirit of God came mightily upon Saul when he heard these words, and his anger was greatly kindled. I got a couple of things to say. First of all, anger is not always wrong. If the Lord's will is being violated and someone says, I am just not getting with the program and I'm going to do what I want, especially if it's hurting God's people, you ought to be angry. Okay? All right. And Saul was justifiably angry. It says in Ephesians chapter 4, be angry, don't sin. So his anger was greatly kindled. This is great. The Spirit of God came mightily upon Saul. That is what makes the difference. Are you being led by the Spirit? Are you responding the way the Spirit would want you? So Saul took a yoke of oxen. This is not like the yoke of an egg. This is like a harness, a wooden frame that 2 oxen fit their heads in so that they can plow together. So one doesn't go this way and the other one go this way. So that means we're talking about 2 oxen, and he cut them in pieces. He's just coming in from the field. And he sent these pieces throughout all of the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers. Hello, FedEx here, meat delivery for the elders of Zebulun. Whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. And then the dread of the Lord fell upon the people, and they came out as one man. What makes the difference, people, in your behavior? The Spirit of God. And then Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel. That's all the tribes except for Judah. 300,000, and the men of Judah, 30,000. So how many is that? 330,000 troops. What makes the difference? In the way Saul responded and the way the people responded after the Lord got involved? It was the Lord. What's the lesson here? Folks, when disaster looms, those filled with the Spirit don't whimper and whine. Whether it's an economic disaster, a pandemic, or some country comes in and takes us over. When disaster looms, those filled with the Spirit don't whimper and whine. They stand firm and they take action. Where do I get that? Well, Daniel said so. In chapter 11, verse number 32, the people who know their God don't whimper and whine. They stand firm and take action. You continue to do what the Lord wants you to do. And what did Israel want? What did God want Israel to do? To drive out their enemies with the help of the Lord. Why do they do that? Because God did not give us a spirit of cowardice. That's a different word than fear there. It's a word that refers to cowardice, but a spirit of power and love and self-control. Is this important to God? I mean, I'm not kidding you. He talks so much in the Old and the New Testament about not fearing and not being anxious, and everybody that I know practically has some justification for their fear and anxiety, as though this is some little thing with the Lord. Let's see if this is a little thing. When God describes the people who will be thrown into the lake of fire, what does he say? As for the cowardly, what tops the list? The cowardly. Those who won't stand for the Lord and take action. The faithless, the polluted, the murderers, the fornicators, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their lot shall be in the lake that burns with sulfur and fire. Folks, it's time to take this seriously, and God is giving us an opportunity, not just in the pandemic, but in what is going to happen to Christians in the coming days. When the Spirit of God is at work in God's people, they don't go running from God's work. They get ready for God's work. Back to Saul's victories. And so they told the messengers who had come, "Thus shall you say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, right around between noon and 2 o'clock maybe, you will have deliverance." And they must have hightailed it back there very quickly. How many miles can you cover in a day? The most I have ever covered on my feet in a day is 24. These guys must have been moving to get there in 3 days and back in 3 days to say on the 7th day, you're going to have deliverance. And when the messengers came and told the men of Jabesh, they were glad. And therefore the men of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow we will give ourselves up to you, Ammonites, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you." And on the next day Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and cut down the Ammonites until the heat of day. That means they did it in a morning. And those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. God raised up a king to do battle against Israel's enemies, and God came through. So after that battle, Saul chose 3,000 men of Israel to be on active duty, and the rest are going to be in the reserve. 2,000 of them were with Saul at Michmash and the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 of these 3,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the rest were sent home, every man to his tent. That's the reserve. They're not on active duty. But the 3,000 are always armed. Got it? Now, who's Jonathan? Jonathan is Saul's son. And we're going to learn a lot about him in the coming weeks. But let me tell you something. He is a force to be reckoned with. He is a godly man, and he trusts the Lord incredibly. He is a good man. And Jonathan isn't the type of guy who's just going to sit around for an opportunity. He's going to make an opportunity. What's the next sentence? Jonathan defeated the garrison, that's their camp, of the Philistines, which was at Geba. And the Philistines heard about it, and they were not happy. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let all the Hebrews hear." What's he doing? He's gathering the reserves back up to active duty. And all Israel heard it, that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, because he gets credit for it, because he's the king. And also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines. What's that mean? That means that they are a stench in the nostrils of the Philistines. How many of you remember Laverne and Shirley? You remember when Lenny and Squiggy would walk in the room? You know, after they would say, "Well, that's terrible and stupid," and they'd open the door, "Hello!" I can remember one time they were displeased with something Laverne had said, and they said, "You make me stink," instead of "you make me sick." Well, this is the way the Philistines are viewing Israel, and the people were called out to join Saul at Gilgal. And the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and troops like the sand of the seashore in multitude. And they came up and encamped in Michmash to the east of Bethaven. Now, folks, how many chariots does Israel have? None. How many horses? They don't have any. All they've got is ground troops. Philistines have got these guys beat militarily every which way that you can possibly think of. And I'm not the only one that thinks so. When the men of Israel saw that they were in straits, for the people were hard pressed, the people, and when it's talking about the people of war, hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in wells, and they crossed the fords of the Jordan to the west, to the land of Gad and Gilead, just to get away. And Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people who were still with him followed him, but they were doing what? Trembling. This is an incredible army, well equipped, that has come against them. So, the first of Saul's vices. Saul waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. Now, apparently, Samuel had given Saul some instruction. I want you to wait here at Gilgal until I come, and then I'll make a sacrifice. Well, Sammy didn't show up when Saul thought he should show up. Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from Saul. In other words, Saul's army is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, if Saul had been a little bit more like Jephthah and knew his biblical history, he would have thought back to a time when Gideon was one of the judges. And Gideon starts out by gathering an army of 32,000 people. And God said to Gideon, "If anybody's afraid, send them home." Well, big surprise. Immediately, 22,000 of the 32,000 say, "See you later. Have fun in the battle." So he's left with 10,000 people, and God says, "Wow, that's still too many." And he whittled it down to 300 people. Now, if Saul had understood what God could do with just a few, then he wouldn't have been trembling, he and the rest of the people. and he wouldn't have jumped the gun and panicked. Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering away from him, and his army's getting smaller, so Saul said, bring that burnt offering over here to me, and the peace offerings. And he, Saul, offered the burnt offering. And as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. What's the theological error here? Saul thinks that the success or failure of his work for God depends upon his strength and his supplies. And his strength and his supplies were fleeing from him. And so Saul panics and says, we got to have a sacrifice. But God said he will guard the feet of his faithful ones, and the wicked shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might shall a man prevail. That's not how God delivers his people, not by their might. A king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. It says in Psalm 33, verse 16. And in Proverbs 21:31, the horse is made ready for the battle, or the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. Have you ever had a fight, guys, with some guy that was a lot bigger than you that you were not supposed to win? God determines the outcome of battles. So Samuel said to Saul, what have you done? And Saul said, well, when I saw that the people were scattering from me, man, people that sin have always got some excuse. And that you did not come within the days appointed. Now he's blaming it on somebody else. You know, if you'd been there, Sam, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down upon me at Gilgal, and I have not entreated the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Sam, it was the only thing I could do. But what did the Lord say? What's the theological error? Saul thinks that doing something for God or giving up something for God will incline God's favor toward him. First, let me ask you this. What inclines God's favor toward us? Repentance and faith. Do you remember the 20 years that Samuel had Israel as the prophet? And he gradually was bringing the hearts of the people back to the Lord. And they put away their foreign gods. They repented and they served the Lord only. And God ended that 20-year period of Philistine oppression with an incredible battle. Israel already has God's favor. Saul already has God's favor as God-appointed king. He doesn't need to do something for God, and he doesn't need to sacrifice or give up something for God that will incline God's favor or grace toward him. I have only one thing to say, and you listen closely out there, you Protestants who may be watching. God is not impressed by something that you give up. I got one word: Lent. Lent. You find Lent in the Bible? You find giving up stuff to curry God's favor or grace in your life? He's not impressed. Put that stuff away from you. Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God. You did what made sense to you in the moment because you panicked and you just had a knee-jerk reaction, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, What man in the Bible is described as a man after God's own heart? That's David, King David. That's right. Was David perfect? No. In many ways, he was lots worse than Saul. But his heart was always toward doing God's work and doing God's will. That's where his direction was. And God doesn't judge us on our perfection, but on our direction. And David was always moving to do what God wanted. And the Lord has appointed him to be prince over his people because you, Saul, have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And it was just simple. Just wait. Samuel will come and do the sacrifice. So Saul numbered the people who were present with him, and he's down to about 600 men. Whoa. And Saul and Jonathan his son and the people who were present with them stayed in Geba of Benjamin, but the Philistines were encamped at Michmash. Now there was no smith, plenty of Jones, but no smith in the land. Now what is he talking about? He's talking about a blacksmith. What does a blacksmith do? Well, today he shoes horses. A blacksmith in those days was responsible for making swords and spears and sharpening your plowshares and all that sort of thing. But the Philistines, who kind of had jurisdiction over things on the western side of the river Jordan, said, nope, you guys aren't allowed to have any blacksmiths. Why? Because you might make swords and spears, and then we'd be in trouble. So there was no smith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, because the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make for themselves swords or spears. So on the day of this battle, there was no sword or spear found in the hand of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, except Saul and Jonathan both had a sword. Wow. Only two people. And you've got an army of 30,000 chariots and lots of horsemen and foot soldiers who all have spears and swords. And Jonathan, the son of Saul, who likes to instigate things, he's not just going to wait for stuff to happen, said to his armor bearer, come on, let's go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. He remembers the story of Gideon. That's the man of faith. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistine. And the Philistines said, look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves. And the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan, his armor bearer, and said, come on up to us. We'll show you a thing or two. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, he gets excited about this, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. And how many of them are there? Well, there's just 2 Israelites, and they head up there. And Jonathan has to climb up the embankment on his hands and knees, and his armor bearer after him. And they, Philistines, fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. What's going on is that Jonathan swings that sword, probably cuts off an arm or a leg or stabs somebody or nicks them or something. They fall down, and coming behind him, the armor bearer maybe takes a club and finishes the job. And the first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within, as it were, a half furrow's length in an acre of land. Now, there's lots more soldiers there. Do these guys care? No. They go up and they immediately kill 20 of them. What happens to the rest of the soldiers? Well, this is the great part. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people of the Philistines. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. What did God say? I am going to put the fear of you in these people. Why don't they trust God to do that? Jonathan did, and it happened. And Saul and all the people who were with him, they weren't with Jonathan, rallied and went into the battle because they saw this great confusion, and the battle had started. And behold, every man's sword among the Philistines was against his fellow Philistines. And there was very great confusion. So instead of killing the Israelites, they killed each other. Who could do that but God? All because someone said, let's just do what God wants us to do. Now the Hebrews, who had been with the Philistines before that time, what are the Hebrews doing with the Philistines? They surrendered, saying, please don't kill us, we'll just surrender. And had gone up with them into the camp. Even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed hard after them in battle. Who are these guys? They're the deserters, not the people that eat dessert. So the Lord delivered Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Bethaven. When Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side. This is kind of a military summary of Saul's tenure as king. 40 years worth. He fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he put them to the worst. That means he got the better of them. And he did valiantly. And he struck the Amalekites, and he delivered Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. So that's basically a military summary of Saul's kingship. Now, what we're going to find out, starting next week, is that most of Saul's victories militarily can be attributed to two people, Jonathan and the future king, David. So what's the lesson here? Your success is not necessarily a sign of God's approval. If you've got success in business, or success in sports, or success in finances, or that you're just terribly good looking and everybody likes you, your success is not necessarily a sign of God's approval. Was Saul militarily successful? He was. Did God approve of Saul? No. He told him, when your kingship ends, that's it for your family and for your sons. The Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked man for the day of trouble. Try to keep that in mind. God has a purpose for Israel. And he can use a righteous man like David, or he can use an evil man like Saul. But God has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked man for the day of trouble. Keep that in mind. And this is why God made Saul successful, because he had a purpose for the nation of Israel. And Samuel said to Saul, this is kind of about 20 years after Saul's first major mess up, the Lord sent me to anoint you king over the people Israel. Now therefore hearken to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek, what Amalek did to Israel, in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Almost immediately after Israel crossed the Red Sea, the Amalekites, who lived down in southern Judah, began attacking and pulling raids on them. And God sent Israel after them, and they won. Now, to get revenge for God, he says, now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them. These instructions are really very simple. But kill both man and woman, infant and nursing infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. That's pretty simple. If it breathes, kill it. So, Saul defeated these Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. Alarms going off in anybody's heads? Okay. And he utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. That's good, right? Okay. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and the best of the oxen, and the fatlings, and the best of the lambs, and all that was good, and they would not utterly destroy them, as the Lord had spoken. All that was despised and worthless, they said, sure, we'll get rid of that. And the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I repent that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me, and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning, and it was told Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, and turned and passed on, and went on down to Gilgal. So Sammy finds him, and he came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed be you to the Lord. That's great. But look at the words that come out of his mouth next. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Why would Saul say that? Because he knows he hasn't. This is just a guilty conscience. And Samuel said, What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears, and the mooing of the oxen that I hear? Saul said, They, who's they? His soldiers. They have brought them from the Amalekites. For the people, who are the people? His soldiers, spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest we utterly destroyed, just like God said. You see how he's making it sound like he's done a good thing for the Lord, and that he's not really responsible because it was somebody else's fault. So Samuel said to Saul, Stop, shut up. I will tell you what the Lord said to me this night. And he said to him, Say on. And Samuel said, Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission, and said, Go, utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop in on the spoil? Who did Saul say? Saul said, Oh, it was my guys. They kept it. But God says, you participated, and you did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. Wow. Isn't that amazing? In what sense has Samuel obeyed? He partially obeyed. God isn't into that. I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. He's listing Agag as in one of the things that he did that was right, keeping him alive. But the people took the spoil. They took the sheep and the ox and the best of the things devoted to destruction. Why? So they could sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. Won't that make God happy? Sacrifice. I mean, that's what he wants, right? Isn't that what all the gods want? In that day and time, that's how you pacified the gods. You pacified the gods with sacrifice. Because those gods needed to eat. And you fed the gods and they did good things for you. And he thinks that our God needs something from us. And Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of," the King James used to say, "witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." As Samuel turned to go away, Saul took a hold of the skirt of his robe, and it tore. God's big into symbolism. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." What's the lesson here? What gains you a right standing before God? What you do for God, or what God does for you? What gained a right standing for us? It's what God did through Jesus Christ for us. We don't need to earn God's favor. Sacrificing, giving up things, making deals and promises to God. Just trust and obey. That's all God wants. We're already a delight in his eyes. Just do what he says. Be about God's business and trust him for the results. Not the labors of my hands can fulfill thy law's demands. Could my zeal no relief or respite know? Could my tears forever flow? All for sin could not atone. Thou must save, and thou alone. Fast forward to the end of Saul's kingship. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel and encamped at Gilboa. And when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. Why? Because the Spirit of God is not at work, and he's whining and whimpering. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. God is not speaking to Saul. If you refuse to listen to God, he no longer will listen to you. In Isaiah 59:2, the prophet says, "Your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he no longer listens." He drew a line in the sand with Saul and said, "This is it." Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. He killed himself. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his own sword and died with him. And thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men on the same day together. And so ended the kingship of Saul. Saul of Benjamin started well, but he finished wrong. He didn't get better, he got worse. God would have established and expanded the kingdom through him and through his posterity if only he had put his trust in God and just followed directions. But as it were, Saul ruined things for Israel. Saul ruined things for himself. And Saul ruined things for Jonathan, his son, who would have been a really, really good king. And they all ended up losing their lives in the battle because of a king who did not trust God enough to follow his directions. Folks, if you don't, you ruin things for your family and for your religious community. Saul of Benjamin was king of Israel from 1050 BC to 1010 BC. He was running well, but he forgot why he was running. And it wasn't for the Lord. It was his own agenda.